I was standing in my small, quiet kitchen, stirring a pot of soup that had been simmering longer than it needed to. Not because it required it, but because I didn't have the energy to stop. The steam fogged my glasses, and for a moment, the world felt soft and distant, like it used to when my children were small and chaos was loud but comforting. The radio played low in the background, some old song I barely recognized, and the clock on the wall ticked loudly enough to remind me that time had become my only companion. I was thinking about nothing in particular when my phone buzzed on the counter. I almost ignored it. Most days no one called anymore. But when I glanced at the screen and saw my daughter's name, my hand froze mid-stir. My heart reacted before my mind could catch up. She never called without a reason. We hadn't argued recently, but we hadn't really talked either. Not the way mothers and daughters should. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered, trying to sound calm. Her voice was tight, rushed, like she was holding something back. She asked me how I was, and I lied automatically, saying I was fine. Then she went quiet. Not the comfortable kind of silence, but the kind that feels heavy, the kind that warns you something is about to change. She finally said my name the way she used to when she was a teenager, and needed help but didn't want to admit it. That was when I felt it. The small, sharp twist in my chest that told me this call wasn't just a check-in. She told me she had stopped by the house earlier. My house. The one she grew up in. I asked why she didn't come inside. She hesitated, then said she didn't think it was a good idea. That's when the soup boiled over, spilling onto the stove with a hiss, and somehow that small mess felt like a warning. I turned off the heat, my hands trembling now, and asked her what she meant. She sighed deeply and said there was something she needed to tell me. Something she should have said a long time ago. As she spoke, her words came slowly, carefully chosen, like stepping through broken glass. She told me she'd seen things around the house that worried her. Lights on when they shouldn't be. Doors unlocked. Things moved. I laughed softly at first, brushing it off as imagination or stress, but she didn't laugh back. Her voice cracked when she said she thought I wasn't safe anymore. Not just physically but emotionally. She said she felt like I was disappearing, little by little, into a life too quiet, too lonely, and she didn't know how to reach me anymore. I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell her I was fine, that I had chosen this quiet, that I didn't need saving. But the truth sat heavy in my throat. The house had felt strange lately. Not haunted or dramatic, just off. Too still. Too empty. And in that silence, old memories had been getting louder. Regrets I thought I had buried kept resurfacing, especially the ones about her. About the times I chose being strong over being present. About the conversations we never finished. As she talked, I realized this wasn't just concern, it was fear. Fear that one day she'd call and no one would answer. Fear that the soup would boil over, the radio would keep playing, and I wouldn't be there to turn it off. When the call ended, the kitchen felt colder than before. I looked around at the worn cabinets, the chipped mug by the sink, the second chair at the table that no one used anymore. And for the first time in years, I wondered if the house wasn't the only thing falling apart. Maybe the real problem wasn't what my daughter thought she saw that day, but what she had finally noticed about me. That night, after the soup had gone cold and the dishes sat untouched in the sink, I walked through the house with a strange awareness, like I was seeing it for the first time through my daughter's eyes. Every creak in the floorboards sounded louder than usual. Every shadow stretched a little too far. I told myself it was nonsense, that loneliness can make even familiar places feel unfamiliar. But doubt has a way of slipping in quietly and settling deep. I checked the front door twice before locking it, then a third time just to be sure. In the hallway mirror, I caught my reflection and barely recognized the woman staring back. Older, yes, but more than that, tired in a way sleep never seemed to fix. I remembered how my daughter used to run down this same hallway as a child, socks sliding on the floor, laughter echoing off the walls. Now the echo was all that remained. I tried calling her back, but it went to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. What would I even say? That I was fine? That I wasn't scared? Because the truth was I was. Not of burglars or ghosts or strangers in the night, but of the slow realization that maybe I had been disappearing without noticing. Over the next few days, small things began to stand out, things I might have ignored before. A cabinet left open in the morning when I was sure I'd closed it. The television on, muted, playing a channel I never watched. Once I found my front gate unlatched, swinging slightly in the wind, and I stood there far longer than necessary, trying to remember if I had gone outside the night before. I started keeping notes for myself, little reminders taped to the fridge. Lock door. Turn stove off. Take medicine. Each note felt like a quiet admission I wasn't ready to make out loud. My daughter texted less after that call, short messages asking if I'd eaten if I was sleeping. I replied with cheerful emojis I didn't feel, hoping distance would convince her everything was normal. But deep down I knew she was watching, waiting for proof she was wrong. One afternoon she showed up unannounced. I heard the knock and felt my stomach drop before I even opened the door. She stood there with concern written all over her face, scanning me like she was looking for cracks. She walked through the house slowly, touching familiar things. The picture frames, the old couch, the dent in the wall from when she'd slammed her bedroom door years ago. When she asked me if I'd been okay lately, I snapped back defensively, accusing her of treating me like a child. The hurt in her eyes was instant, and I hated myself for causing it, but fear has a sharp edge, and mine cut before I could stop it. She didn't argue. She just sat at the kitchen table, the same one where she'd once done homework while I cooked, and told me she was worried because she loved me, not because she wanted control. She said she felt like she was losing me in pieces, and she didn't know how to stop it. I wanted to tell her that parents aren't supposed to become burdens, that I had spent my whole life making sure she never had to worry about me. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, tears slipped out, quiet and stubborn, surprising both of us. She reached for my hand, and in that moment, the house felt smaller, closer, like it was listening. That was when she told me something she hadn't planned to say yet, that she had spoken to someone about me. A doctor. A social worker. Just to ask questions. She said quickly, seeing my reaction. My chest tightened and the room seemed to tilt. I heard judgment where she meant help. I heard endings where she meant safety. I pulled my hand away and stood up, my voice shaking as I told her she had no right. The argument that followed was quiet but devastating, filled with pauses heavier than shouting. When she finally left, the silence returned thicker than ever. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, replaying her words again and again. I realized that what scared me most wasn't losing my independence. It was admitting that I might already have lost parts of myself, and no one had noticed until now. And somewhere between fear and exhaustion, a single thought kept repeating. What if she was right, and what if it was already too late to pretend otherwise? The days after our argument blurred together in a way that made time feel unreliable. Mornings came too fast, nights stretched endlessly, and somewhere in between I kept losing track of myself. I would walk into a room and forget why I was there. Stand at the window and stare outside without remembering how long I'd been standing. At first, I laughed it off, telling myself everyone forgets things sometimes, especially at my age. But the laughter didn't last. One afternoon, I burned my hand on a pot I didn't remember turning on, the sharp pain snapping me back into the present with terrifying clarity. I sat on the kitchen floor afterward, cradling my hand, shaking, not from the burn, but from the realization that something was slipping, and no amount of pride could hold it in place. I started avoiding phone calls, especially from my daughter. Every ring felt like an accusation, every message like a test I might fail. Instead, I filled the silence with old memories. Flipping through photo albums late into the night, tracing familiar faces with my fingers as if touching them might anchor me. But even the memories began to betray me. I couldn't place certain events in order anymore. Birthdays blended together. Vacations felt like dreams I wasn't sure I'd lived. Once, I found myself calling my daughter by my sister's name, and the look on her face when she gently corrected me haunted me long after the call ended. I noticed how careful she'd become, choosing her words slowly, repeating herself without pointing it out, asking questions that sounded casual but felt measured. It made me angry, then ashamed for feeling angry at all. One evening, I heard a sound in the house. A soft thud from the hallway. My heart raced as I grabbed a broom, ridiculous but desperate, and crept toward the noise. I found nothing. No intruder. No explanation. Just my own reflection in the dark mirror at the end of the hall. Eyes wide, breathing shallow. I realized then how fragile my sense of safety had become. How quickly fear filled the gaps where certainty used to live. The next morning my daughter showed up again, this time with a calm I didn't recognize. She didn't argue. She didn't accuse. She simply said she wanted me to come with her to an appointment, just one, so we could talk to someone together. I refused immediately, My voice firm even as my hands trembled. She didn't push. She only asked me one question that cut deeper than any argument. Are you happy like this? Or are you just pretending you're not scared? I didn't answer. Because the truth was I didn't know anymore. That afternoon after she left, I wandered into my bedroom and opened the closet, looking for a sweater I'd worn 1,000 times. I couldn't find it. I tore through the shelves, the drawers, growing more frantic by the second, until I sank onto the bed, exhausted and defeated. Later, I found the sweater in the refrigerator, folded neatly like it belonged there. I stared at it for a long time, unable to breathe. There was no joking that away. No clever excuse. That moment broke something in me. For the first time, I admitted only to myself that I might need help. But admitting it didn't make it easier. It made it heavier. Because needing help meant trusting someone else with parts of my life I had always controlled. That night, I dreamed I was walking through my house, room by room, turning off lights, but every time I flipped a switch, another light came on somewhere else. I woke up crying, the meaning too obvious to ignore. The next day, I didn't stop my daughter when she called. I didn't argue when she spoke carefully, hope trembling in her voice. I told her about the sweater, about the burned hand, about the fear that followed me like a shadow. She didn't say, "I told you so." She just listened. And in that silence, I felt both smaller and strangely lighter, as if the weight I'd been carrying alone had finally been shared. But even as relief settled in, another fear crept up behind it. Because once you admit you're losing control, you can't unsee it. And I knew deep down that this was only the beginning of something that would change everything. Agreeing to that appointment didn't feel like a victory or a relief. It felt like surrender dressed up as responsibility. The morning of the visit, I woke before my alarm, heart pounding as if I were about to confess a crime rather than talk about my mind. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made me feel like myself. Neat, composed, capable, hoping fabric and routine could hide the cracks forming underneath. My daughter arrived early, her smile gentle but cautious, as if she were approaching a skittish animal. The drive was quiet, too quiet. I watched the familiar streets slide past the window, suddenly afraid that one day they wouldn't look familiar at all. Inside the clinic, everything smelled like antiseptic and old paper, and the ticking clock in the waiting room sounded unbearably loud. When the doctor finally called my name, I almost didn't stand up. My legs felt heavy, rooted to the chair, as though my body was protesting before my mind could. The questions started simple, dates, names, everyday details, but quickly became traps I didn't see coming. I stumbled over answers I should have known. Paused too long. Guessed when guessing felt safer than admitting I didn't know. I glanced at my daughter once and saw her hands clenched tightly in her lap, knuckles white, eyes fixed on the floor. That look hurt more than any diagnosis could have. When the doctor spoke gently about early signs and further evaluation, the words floated above me, detached from meaning, until one sentence landed with brutal clarity. "You're not imagining this." I nodded, even smiled politely, but inside something collapsed. On the way home, I stared straight ahead, refusing to cry, refusing to give the moment the satisfaction of breaking me in public. But the tears came anyway once I was alone in my bedroom, hot and unstoppable, soaked into the pillow like grief with no clear shape. I wasn't just mourning memory loss. I was mourning independence, dignity, the version of myself who never needed reminders or supervision. In the days that followed, my daughter started making suggestions, labels on cabinets, notes by the door, alarms on my phone. Each one felt like a small insult, even though I knew they came from love. I snapped at her more than once, then hated myself for it. The tension grew, thick and unspoken, until one evening she finally said what we were both avoiding: that maybe it wasn't safe for me to live alone anymore. The room seemed to tilt. I laughed, sharp and defensive, asking if she planned to lock me away next. Her eyes filled with tears as she said she was scared, that she lay awake at night imagining me falling, forgetting the stove, wandering outside and not finding my way back. Hearing my worst fears spoken aloud made them real in a way I couldn't undo. Still, I refused. I told her I wasn't helpless, that I'd managed my entire life just fine, that one diagnosis didn't erase decades of competence. She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly, which somehow felt worse. The breaking point came a week later. On a cold morning when I went out to buy groceries and couldn't remember how to get home. I stood on a corner I'd walked 100 times, panic rising as every street looked wrong, every house unfamiliar. I called my daughter with shaking hands, my voice barely recognizable even to myself. She found me sitting on a curb, clutching my purse like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. She didn't scold me. She wrapped her arms around me and cried into my coat, and for the first time I cried too, not just from fear but from exhaustion. That night we talked honestly, painfully about what came next. About moving in with her, about doctors and routines and changes I wasn't ready for. I agreed not because I suddenly wanted to, but because I was tired of pretending strength meant doing everything alone. Packing my house felt like erasing myself piece by piece. Every object carried a memory, every room an echo of who I'd been. As I closed the door for the last time, I realized something terrifying and strange at once. Letting go wasn't the end of my story, but it was the end of the illusion that I could keep it exactly the same. Moving into my daughter's house felt less like arriving somewhere new, and more like shrinking into a version of life that no longer belonged to me. The guest room was clean, bright, thoughtfully prepared, but it wasn't mine, and every detail reminded me of that fact. The bed was softer than the one I'd slept in for years, yet I woke each morning stiff and disoriented, reaching for habits that no longer fit the space. My routines, once effortless, now required permission. When to eat, where things were kept, which drawer was mine and which I shouldn't touch. My daughter tried to make it seamless, casual, but I could hear the careful planning behind every suggestion. She labeled shelves with a cheerful tone that didn't quite hide the worry underneath, set reminders on my phone that buzzed like tiny alarms of failure, and gently corrected me when I repeated stories I didn't remember telling before. I told myself to be grateful, and I was, but gratitude didn't cancel the humiliation that crept in when I realized she now locked the door at night and quietly checked that the stove was off after I cooked. Her husband was polite, kind even, but I could feel the shift in the household, the subtle recalibration of space now that I was there. Conversations lowered when I entered the room. Decisions were made without me, then explained slowly, carefully, like instructions to a child. I hated myself for noticing every small thing, for interpreting kindness as control, but once the thought took root, it poisoned everything. One afternoon I overheard my daughter on the phone, whispering in the kitchen while she thought I was napping. Spoke in hushed, urgent tones about doctor appointments, about how tired she was, about how she loved me but didn't know how long she could manage this. I stood frozen in the hallway, the words sinking deep, heavier than any diagnosis. For the first time I wondered if love could coexist with resentment, and if so, how long before resentment won. That night I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying moments from my life when I had been the caretaker, the strong one, the person others leaned on. I remembered nights rocking my daughter when she was sick, days juggling work and home without complaint. Years of quiet sacrifices that no one ever noticed because that was simply expected. And now here I was, reduced to a responsibility, a problem to solve, a future burden everyone was afraid to name. The next morning I insisted on making breakfast, determined to reclaim some sense of usefulness. Halfway through I forgot what I was cooking. The pan smoked, the smell sharp and accusing, and my daughter rushed in, fear flashing across her face before she masked it with forced calm. She took over without asking, her movements efficient, practiced, final. Something inside me snapped. I accused her of treating me like I was already gone, of stealing my independence one helpful act at a time. She fired back, voice shaking, that she was terrified of losing me and that every decision she made was fueled by that fear. We stood there, surrounded by the smell of burned food and unspoken grief, both of us crying, both of us right and wrong at the same time. After that fight things changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly, like a hairline crack spreading through glass. I started withdrawing, spending more time alone in my room, avoiding situations where I might fail. My daughter tried harder, which only made me retreat further. The house felt smaller each day, the walls closing in with expectations I couldn't meet. I began to wonder if this arrangement, meant to keep me safe, was slowly erasing me instead. One evening as I watched my daughter juggle dinner, homework and phone calls, exhaustion etched into her face, a painful clarity settled over me. I wasn't just losing myself, I was taking pieces of her with me. And that realization scared me more than forgetting names or places ever could. I began to ask questions I'd been too afraid to voice before. Was this really the best solution? Was love supposed to feel like suffocation? And if holding on meant hurting the people I loved most, what did letting go actually look like? The idea came to me quietly, not as a dramatic revelation but as a tired thought that refused to leave once it arrived. I was sitting alone in the guest room, listening to the muffled sounds of my daughter's life continuing on the other side of the door, laughter, footsteps, the television murmuring in the background, and I realized that this wasn't living together anymore. It was coexisting out of obligation. I loved her and she loved me, but love alone wasn't enough to bridge the growing distance between who I was and who she feared I was becoming. That night, I searched online for assisted living communities not because I wanted to leave but because I wanted control over the leaving. I wanted it to be my decision, not something whispered about behind closed doors or forced after a crisis. The websites were polished and reassuring, filled with smiling seniors and promises of independence, but behind the marketing I could feel the weight of the truth. This would be a line crossed, a chapter closed. For days I said nothing, carrying the decision alone while observing my daughter more carefully than ever. I noticed how she flinched when I misplaced my keys, how she hovered when I walked down the stairs, how every moment of care was laced with fear. One evening after dinner, when the house was quiet and the exhaustion between us hung heavy in the air, I told her I was thinking about moving into a community where I could have my own space, my own routine, my own dignity. Her reaction wasn't relief as I had feared. It was devastation. Her eyes filled instantly, her voice breaking as she accused herself of failing me, of not doing enough, of choosing convenience over compassion. I tried to explain that this wasn't about her shortcomings but about my need to remain myself for as long as I could. But words are clumsy things when emotions run high. The conversation stretched late into the night, looping through guilt, fear, love, and anger, until we were both drained. In the days that followed, the house felt suspended in uncertainty. My daughter alternated between overcompensating with affection and withdrawing into silence, unsure how to act around me now that the unspoken future had been spoken aloud. I began visiting a nearby facility, telling myself it was just to gather information, but each visit made the decision more real. The residents were welcoming, their stories layered with loss and resilience, and for the first time in months, I felt seen as a person rather than a problem. Still, the guilt lingered. Every time I returned to my daughter's house, I wondered if I was choosing myself at the cost of her peace of mind. The turning point came unexpectedly. During a routine doctor's appointment my daughter insisted on attending. As the doctor spoke about progression, safety, and planning ahead, I watched my daughter's face crumble under the weight of responsibility she never asked for. In that moment, clarity struck with painful precision. If I stayed, she would spend her life bracing for the worst, measuring every day by how much of me remained. I didn't want to be the axis around which her anxiety revolved. I wanted to be her mother, not her constant fear. That evening, I made my decision final. I told her calmly, firmly that I was going to move not because I was giving up, but because I was choosing a different way to keep our relationship intact. She cried, then grew quiet, then nodded, understanding dawning slowly, painfully. Packing my things was harder than I expected. Every object carried memories. Every decision felt like erasing evidence of who I had been. On my last night in her house, we sat together on the couch, not talking much, just sharing the kind of silence that comes from deep love and deep sadness. When the morning came and the car was loaded, she hugged me tightly, longer than usual, as if trying to memorize the shape of me. As we drove away, I looked back at the house that had been both refuge and prison, knowing that this choice would redefine our relationship forever. I didn't know if the future would be kinder or crueler, only that for the first time in a long while the next step was mine to take. Moving into the new place didn't feel like the fresh start the brochures promised. It felt more like stepping into someone else's paused life and trying to figure out where I fit. The room was clean, neutral, almost too quiet, and as I unpacked my few belongings, I became painfully aware of how much I had left behind, not just furniture or familiar walls, but a version of myself that existed in relation to my daughter's daily life. The first few nights were the hardest. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds, distant footsteps, a cough down the hallway, the soft hum of machines I didn't recognize. I told myself this was temporary, that every change feels wrong before it feels right, but doubt crept in during the quiet hours. I wondered if I had mistaken independence for isolation, if I had traded one kind of loneliness for another. During the days, I tried to follow the schedule. Meals at set times, activities announced over the intercom, smiling faces that were friendly but cautious, each of us measuring how much of our stories to share. I met people who had once been teachers, mechanics, nurses, parents who had raised entire families and now struggled to remember what they ate for breakfast. Their honesty was disarming, their humor sharp in a way only life-worn people can manage, and slowly, against my own resistance, I began to feel less alone. Still, every time my daughter visited, the room seemed to shrink with the weight of unspoken questions. She tried to hide her worry behind cheerful updates and reassurances, but I could see the guilt flickering behind her smile, the fear that she had abandoned me even though this had been my choice. One afternoon, during a group session meant to encourage storytelling, something unexpected happened. A woman across from me, not much older than I was, began talking about how her children stopped calling once she moved in, how the distance grew not because of miles but because of discomfort. Her voice didn't tremble with bitterness, only with acceptance, and as I listened, a cold realization settled in my chest. I had been so focused on protecting my daughter from the burden of caring for me that I hadn't considered how this distance might quietly reshape our bond. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something precious was slipping away, while I was busy convincing myself this was the right decision. I called my daughter not to reassure her, but to tell her I was scared, not of being here but of losing us. She was silent for a long moment before admitting she felt the same, that every visit felt like a reminder of time she couldn't get back, of moments she feared she was already missing. That conversation changed something between us. Instead of pretending everything was fine, we allowed ourselves to sit with the truth, messy and unresolved. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice small shifts. My daughter visited more intentionally, staying longer, listening more, no longer hovering or correcting me, just being present. And I, in turn, stopped pretending I didn't need her, allowing myself to ask for help without shame. One evening during dinner, an argument broke out at a nearby table between a resident and his son, sharp words cutting through the room like glass. The son's frustration spilled over, accusations of sacrifice and obligation tumbling out in front of strangers, and I watched the man's face collapse into something heartbreakingly small. In that moment, I understood with painful clarity that this move wasn't just about where I lived. It was about how easily love can turn into resentment when fear is left unspoken. I realized that leaving my daughter's house hadn't solved everything. It had simply given us space to face the truth without drowning in it. Later that night, alone in my room, I sat by the window and thought about all the versions of motherhood I had lived through. The protector, the provider, the background support, and now, unexpectedly, the lesson. I couldn't stop time or reverse what was happening inside my mind, but I could choose how we walked through it together. The next morning, I surprised myself by signing up to volunteer in the community library. Something small, something mine. The first day, as I helped organize books, a sense of purpose flickered back to life, fragile but real. When I told my daughter about it, her voice brightened in a way I hadn't heard in months, and for the first time since I moved, we laughed together without sadness trailing behind. I began to understand that independence wasn't about doing everything alone. It was about choosing connection without guilt. And yet, beneath the cautious optimism, a question lingered, one I couldn't fully answer yet. What happens when the day comes that I can no longer make these choices for myself? That thought stayed with me, quietly, persistently, as if preparing me for a conversation I wasn't ready to have, but one I knew was coming. The question I had been quietly carrying finally demanded an answer on a morning that seemed ordinary in every other way. The kind of morning where sunlight falls softly through the curtains and nothing feels urgent until it suddenly is. I was tying my shoes for my volunteer shift when my hands wouldn't cooperate, fingers stiff and unresponsive, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I couldn't remember the last step of a task I had done thousands of times before. Panic rose fast, sharp and undeniable, and I sat there on the edge of the bed, breathing slowly, forcing myself to stay present. Passed eventually, but it left something behind, a truth I could no longer ignore. That afternoon, when my daughter arrived, I didn't brush it off or change the subject. I told her what had happened, every uncomfortable detail, and watched her face shift from concern to resolve. There were no tears, no dramatic promises, Just a quiet understanding settling between us like a shared agreement neither of us needed to say out loud. We talked about the future honestly for the first time. Not in vague reassurances but in real plans, preferences, boundaries. I told her what I wanted if the day came that I couldn't advocate for myself, and she listened, not as a child being burdened, but as a partner in a conversation built on love rather than obligation. Something healed in that exchange, something that had been fractured long before I moved out of her house. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly right. I continued volunteering, formed friendships that were rooted not in pity, but in shared experience, and learned to accept help without feeling diminished by it. My daughter became part of this life too, no longer standing outside it with guilt in her eyes, but stepping into it with confidence and warmth. One evening, as we sat together watching the sun dip below the horizon, she admitted she had once feared that caring for me would swallow her whole, that resentment would replace love, and that fear had terrified her more than the thought of losing me. I told her I understood, that love isn't proven by endurance alone but by honesty, by knowing when to step closer and when to step back. The relief on her face was unmistakable, as if she had been holding her breath for years without realizing it. Time, of course, continued its quiet work on me. Some days were sharper than others, moments slipping through my fingers no matter how tightly I held on. But I learned that forgetting didn't erase who I was. It only changed how I needed to be remembered. I wrote things down, labeled drawers, laughed at myself when I repeated stories, and trusted the people around me to fill in the gaps without judgment. On my birthday, surrounded by new friends and my daughter sitting proudly beside me, I realized that this chapter of my life, the one I had feared most, wasn't a closing act but a transformation. I wasn't being tucked away. I was being supported. I wasn't a burden. I was still a mother, a woman, a person with value beyond what I could provide. And in that realization came peace. Not the kind that denies sadness or loss, but the kind that allows them to exist without defining everything. The night before my daughter left after her visit, she hugged me longer than usual and whispered that she was grateful, not just for the years I had raised her, but for the way I was teaching her now, showing her that love doesn't have to hurt to be real. As I watched her walk away, I didn't feel abandoned or afraid. I felt proud. Proud that we had chosen understanding over resentment, connection over guilt, truth over silence. I don't know what tomorrow will take from me, but I know what it has already given me. A chance to live this season of life with dignity, honesty, and love. And if there's one thing I want you to remember from my story, it's this: growing older doesn't mean growing smaller, and asking for help doesn't mean you've failed. It means you've loved enough to trust someone with your truth.